Welcome back to Youth Group Radio.
My child, come home. I never once left you alone. When did you first believe I'd withhold from you anything? I've given you my love, my name, shedding tears and blood to heal your shame. Where are you? Why are you hiding? Who told you you're not fit to stand beside me? Oh, the songs I'll sing when you're undone, and joy's made full in salvation. As time slips by, I stand alone while you gain the world, but lose your soul. I long to say the words to make you turn from lesser things.
John chapter 11. I'm going to be reading verses 1 through 44. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you. And are you going to go there again? Jesus answered them, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant he was taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. But when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give it to you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. When she said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, The teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. Heavenly Father, we ask that you would show yourself to us in a new way, that our hearts would be humble in the presence of how good you are. We love you. It's in your name we pray, Jesus. Amen. Have you ever felt like God was ignoring your prayers? Probably, right? But most of us church folk, we never would actually accuse God of ignoring our prayers. Typically, we think things like, well, it's probably just my fault. I probably didn't pray right. My motives were probably not pure, or maybe it just isn't God's will. What's that really annoying saying that Christians made up where they say, when you pray, God always gives an answer. It's either a yes, a no, or a later. And I think that is just, it makes me want to hurl every time I hear someone say that. But yeah, so there's that answer too. Maybe it just isn't God's will. Maybe he heard me, but he's communicating something else to me. All fine Christian responses. That's totally fine. But then you look at this story, and it's really cool because it's as if you get to see your prayers played out, your prayers acted out. Think about it. The sisters, Mary and Martha, they send a prayer to Jesus. Their brother Lazarus, he's very sick. And so they send a prayer to their Lord. And how do they word their prayer? Verse 3, they say, Lord, he whom you love is ill. This is a very common prayer for me to say. If someone, I feel like I do it all the time. If someone is in need, whether it's sickness or a tough situation, I often find myself reminding the Lord that he loves the person that I'm praying for. Like if I was praying for one of my sisters, I will remind the Lord how much he loves them. I'm like, Lord, I love my sister, but I know that you love her even more than I do. She needs you. Or whoever it is that I'm praying for, I know that you love them more. And it's not that I think Jesus forgets, that he loves the people that I pray for. And it's not that Mary and Martha are saying that he's forgotten that he loves Lazarus. But honestly, whenever I say it, whenever I remind God how much he loves whoever I'm praying for, it's really a comfort for me when I say it. It's really something that helps me and gives me confidence as I am like saying the truth. Like the truth is, you do love them more, God. And so, and I keep on praying for them, and it's comforting, and it's comforting for Mary and Martha as they send their prayer. Jesus, you love Lazarus; he's ill. It's comforting for them to remind themselves that Jesus loves him, and so they send their prayer off to Jesus. And what is Jesus's answer? Verse 4, he says, "This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." What an answer! What a wonderfully optimistic, hopeful answer. I remember one time a woman's husband was very sick in the hospital, and she asked me to pray fervently for her husband. And I did, and I was praying as hard as I could. And she asked me, "All right, so what did the Lord say? Is my husband going to be okay, or is he not?" And I'm like thinking, that's a lot of pressure. I didn't really have an answer for her. But then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I said, "Glory." Glory? Glory? She asked, she's like, "Glory?" And I said, "There is still much more glory to be seen." And the words just flew out of me. I said it lucidly and confidently. There's still much more glory to be seen. And she asked me, "Are you sure?" And I said, "I am." I knew that that was just from the Lord. As far as I was concerned, that word from the Lord, that glory word from the Lord that I received, meant that her husband was going to pull through. Just a couple days later, he was gone. He didn't make it. Jesus answered his sisters. He says, "There's going to be glory in this. It doesn't lead to death, it's glory." But then what does Jesus do? Well, verse 6, it says that he heard that Lazarus was ill, and he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. How comforting of a picture is that, right? Oh, you send your prayer to Jesus. He gives you a brief word of comfort, like, "Oh, it's going to be okay." But then he just stays where he's at for 2 days and does nothing about it. And this is the real question, listeners. This is the real question to ponder. What was Jesus doing during those 2 days? What was he doing during those 2 days? Now keep going with me, and perhaps we will see. After the 2 days, Jesus finally says to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." He's known that Lazarus is dead for 2 days. He didn't even tell, or that Lazarus was sick, and he didn't even tell his disciples. He just finally, after 2 days, says, "Let's go back to Judea." His disciples they're worried, right? Because they know that there's a lot of influential people in Jerusalem who want to have Jesus killed. And they're about to go to a place called Bethany, which is just 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. It's pretty much right there. But then Jesus responds to their worries by telling them a really strange little saying in verse 9 about how people who walk in the daytime don't stumble, but people who walk around at nighttime, they do stumble. What does that mean here? Well, he's reminding them that he is the light of the world. Right? John chapter 8, verse 12, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Jesus is saying here in John 11:9 that the only way they're going to know where to go is if they follow him. If you try to steer your course by your understanding, your own understanding, by your own logic, you will trip up. You see, they had good logic. People wanted to kill Jesus in Jerusalem. He's now wanting to head right towards Jerusalem. Maybe they should reconsider going. But here's the thing. Even when everything makes sense on paper, it's still our own efforts. And if the light is leading you to go against all of that logic, that is where you must go. Jesus explains, "Lazarus is sleeping, and I need to wake him up." The disciples, they still don't get it. They're still relying on their own understanding. They're like, "Okay, he's asleep. Okay, so let him sleep, Lord. He'll be okay." So Jesus, he spells it out plainly for them in verse 14. Lazarus has died. We're going to him. And then we're introduced to the character Thomas, who will make a very important appearance at the end of this gospel as well. And Thomas speaks up, and he says, "Let's go, guys, that we may die with him." Now, Thomas's understanding is still wrong. He still made out the wrong conclusion, but his deepest conclusion is that we must follow Jesus. Thomas demonstrates something crucial right here. Faith, even when it made no sense to Thomas, and he came to the conclusion that, well, we're all going to die, he still put his faith in Jesus. It's not, right? It's not much of a faith. He thinks that Jesus is probably wrong and is probably going to get them all killed, but he knows that he must follow him even when it makes zero sense. Jesus and the disciples, they finally they head towards the town of Bethany, and they don't even quite get to Bethany, and before Martha meets up with him. Martha literally runs to him before he can ever actually reach Bethany. Okay, but by the time Jesus even gets to this point, Lazarus has already been dead in the tomb for 4 days. When was the last time you said, if only? If only I would have studied harder for that test. If only they wouldn't have stepped in front of that car. If only she would have just stayed home instead of trying to drive on the icy roads. If only I would have got one more chance to say, if only I could go back and do it differently. Do things differently. Maybe things would have turned out differently. Turned out better. If only, insert whatever your if only is. When was the last time you were saying if only? See, the problem is we're full of if onlys, and our if onlys, they only make us feel sick. Because no matter how much we may wish to turn back the clock and change things, we can't. Martha is feeling a deep if only. Verse 21, she says, Lord, if only you would have been there, my brother would not have died. She knows. I mean, she's not stupid. She knows it shouldn't have taken Jesus 4 days to get there. What was keeping him? If only he had gotten there sooner. Jesus looks at her and he says, your brother will rise again. You know, that sounds like the phrase that we tell each other when someone passes away. We're trying to comfort them and we say, hey, they're in a better place. And it sounds nice, and it is nice, but it doesn't change the pain felt by the sudden loss of a loved one. Martha responds by saying, yes, I know. He will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. You see, for Martha and for many of the Jewish people in the first century, the resurrection was an event, was something that was going to happen on the last day, when people would be raised from the dead to live in God's new world. But do you see? For Martha, the resurrection is something very far off. Something, I mean, it's literally, she's calling it, it's on the last day. At the end of all endings. The resurrection is something that she cannot see, that she can't touch. It's really just more of an idea. It's really more than anything, maybe it's just something that she tells herself to give herself a little bit of hope that, well, it's not the total end right now, but it's completely untouchable for her. But then what does Jesus say in verse 25? He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus is once again answering our question of who is Jesus. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? See, according to Jesus, resurrection isn't just a distant future event. Resurrection isn't just something to believe in or to not believe in. It's not just a doctrine to theorize about. According to Jesus, resurrection is a person, and he is standing right in front of Martha, and he is asking her to make a huge jump of faith, trust, and hope. she says, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." He is challenging her. He's urging her to exchange her if only for an if Jesus. It's an exchange of if only for if Jesus. See, no longer if only, but if Jesus. If Jesus is who he says he is, and who Martha is beginning to believe he is, if Jesus is the Messiah, the one who was promised by the prophets, the one who has come into the world, if Jesus is God's own Son, if Jesus really is the resurrection, if Jesus really is the life, if Jesus is who Martha just said he is, then it's no longer if only Jesus, it's if Jesus. And if he really is who he says, who Martha has just said he is, then she must have faith. If Jesus is who Martha just said he is, we must have faith. Most of us are aware of Mary and Martha, right? We know the Mary-Martha story. It's in Luke chapter 10. He shows us a story which portrays Martha as the busybody and Mary as the calmer, quieter one. And we see this same dynamic in this story, right? As soon as Martha heard that Jesus was about to be in town, she ran to meet him outside of town to confront him directly. He's late, and she cannot wait any longer. Many of us are like that, right? We feel impatient with God. I've been asking you, and you haven't done anything. And we feel impatient. We're like, what's happening? What's taking so long? And if you're like that, God hates you. No, just kidding. Sorry. If you're like that, that is okay. Run to confront Jesus and bring all of your if onlys with you. Oh, if only this, if only that. Bring them all. Tell him the problem. Ask him why he couldn't come sooner and why he allowed this awful thing to happen. Do it. And then be prepared for a surprising response. You see, Jesus responded to Martha by reintroducing himself to her, right? She knows who Jesus is, but he reintroduced himself to her in a way that she was not expecting. He said, "I am the resurrection." You see, Martha was wanting healing. She was wanting resurrection. She was wanting her brother back, but it all seemed too far off. And so Jesus, she brings all of her problems, all of her if-onlys to Jesus, and Jesus, what does he do? He reintroduces himself to her. She knows who Jesus is, but he reintroduces himself to her. He doesn't say, "I'm in charge. I'm the king here. Just trust me." No, he says, "Hi, I'm the resurrection. I'm everything your heart is desperate for right now." See, the question is, do you believe? It's going to take faith. Even when it makes no sense on paper, let Jesus reintroduce himself to you and show you that he is exactly what you're needing. He is the light, and with him you won't stumble. In verse 28, we see that Jesus is wanting to see Martha's sister Mary. As soon as Mary realizes that Jesus is calling for her, right, she gets up quickly, she runs to Jesus. Mary is, right, she's the calmer, the more quiet, perhaps the more shy sister, but she's as soon as she loves Jesus and she hears he's wanting to see her, and she runs to him. But then whenever she gets to Jesus, we see that both Martha and Mary are carrying the same heavy if only, right? Mary sees Jesus, she immediately falls at his feet and she says, "Lord, if only you would have been here, my brother would not have died." Verse 33 says that Jesus looked at Mary weeping, and he looks at the Jews who were with her, who were also weeping, and he became deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Now, when it says he was deeply moved, the word in the Greek there is embrymaumai. Embrimaumai. And it usually is used to refer to a type of anger. Jesus has a deep anger in his spirit, and he is greatly troubled. Why? Is he mad at the people's lack of faith? No, he's not. Just look at his response. He doesn't say, "Oh, you of little faith." Instead, he looks at all of them weeping. And then what does he say? He says, "Where have you laid him?" They say, "Lord, come and see." In verse 35, we see Jesus unable to hold it in anymore. Jesus wept. Jesus began to weep. You know, John began his gospel by telling us in chapter 1 that Jesus is the Word made flesh. Jesus is God in the flesh, the Word. Through the whole world was made. The Word weeps like a baby at the grave of his friend. Only when we stop and ponder this will we begin to understand the full mystery of John's gospel and the full mystery of just who God is. Only when we throw away our old ideas of who God is, our ideas of him being this emotionless, stubborn, strict God who feels nothing. And when we throw those away and we begin to let Jesus show us who God is, and he shows us that he's crying, that's when we begin to see who God truly is. That's what we begin to realize what God truly means. You see, a lot of times we think that, it's weak, that it's weak to cry. But I would say, show me someone who never cries, and I'll show you their weakness. They are so weak. Show me a God. Think of it like this: show me a God who shows no compassion, who doesn't shed any tears, who is so detached from our situation, who just looks upon our suffering and feels nothing. Yeah, and that is a weak God. Who says, "Oh, I'm just above all of this." That's a weak God. And I'll show you Jesus, the God who steps into human history and who weeps with us in our pain, in our suffering. Yeah, that is strength. That is power beyond what we have ever known. Jesus bursts into tears with everyone else. Isaiah chapter 53, read the whole chapter later if you want. Isaiah 53 verse 4 says, "He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows." Jesus does not just say, "Oh, suck it up, I am here, I can fix it." No. He weeps. You are never alone in your tears. Jesus is the man of sorrows that Isaiah prophesied about. And he knows our grief and pain, and he shares our sufferings, and he takes on our suffering upon himself. He cries with us. And some of the people in the crowd were moved by the tears of Jesus, but others were confused. They say, "Why is he crying? Couldn't he have done something about this? He opened the eyes of the blind. Couldn't he have healed Lazarus?" What we will eventually see in John's gospel is that Jesus came not only to open the eyes of the blind and heal the sick, he came to die for the world. And it's only through his death that the world will be saved. You see, there is a straight, direct line from Jesus' tears in verse 35 to the death in which Jesus will share and bear not only the grief and pain of the world, but also the doom of the world. In verse 38, Jesus is once again deeply moved. He's deeply imbrimaumai, once again, deeply angry. What is he angry at? Jesus came to earth to defeat sin and death, and he is standing at the tomb of his friend, staring death in the face. And in a way that I really can't capture, a way that words truly cannot fully capture, Jesus is angry at death. He does not accept it. He says, "Take away the stone." Martha speaks up. She's worried about the body of her brother. It's been in there for 4 days. It's going to smell. It might seem like a shallow concern, but this is her brother, and she wants to honor him. She doesn't want people associating her memories of her brother with the smell of death. Okay, so she's understandably worried. But Jesus replies to her in verse 40 by saying, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you will see the glory of God?" Jesus then lifts his eyes up and prays to the Father, which we will look at in just a second. And then after his prayer, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." In Mark chapter 5, there's a moment when Jesus raises a guy named Jairus' daughter. Okay, there was a guy named Jairus. His daughter was sick. She died. And Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead in Mark chapter 5. But in that story, when Jesus did it, he had everybody leave the room. Pretty much everyone leave the room. And he strictly told the people who were in the room, "Don't you dare tell anybody what just happened here," after he raised the girl from the dead to life. But now here in John chapter 11, he doesn't get to tell anyone to leave. He stands in front of a large crowd, and his reputation is on the line. And not only that, it's not just that his reputation's on the line, it's that if he's successful in doing this, people are going to be talking. It's going to spread. It's going to upset the people who want him destroyed. And so, what does Jesus do? In this moment, he shouts at a tomb. Can you imagine how silly that looks? Shouting at a tomb? I mean, if I saw someone at a cemetery and they were shouting at graves saying, "Come on out," I would be worried about that person. I would think like, wow, they must be really hurting right now. They probably have something mentally wrong with them in this moment. They need help. I would be genuinely concerned and I would feel bad for them. Jesus just shouted at a tomb. And what happens? What happens? The dead man comes out. A moment of horror and joy all mixed together. Lazarus was in there for 4 days. 4 days dead. How in the world has his body not begun to decompose? There's no smell, guys. Look for it in the text. I've literally preached because later on, I think it's in chapter 12, in John, there's a story where Mary and Martha are in the house and Lazarus is there too. And Mary's pouring perfume. And I've preached on that before. And I talked about all the different smells. You can smell the fish being cooked. You can smell the perfume. And you can smell death in the room and stuff. And because Lazarus was still stinking. But when you read that story, I don't know why I ever said that. Because when you read that story, there's no mention of smell. There's no mention of smell at all. Okay? No foul odor. How? He's been in there 4 days. How was Jesus able to simply walk up to the tomb and just say a word? And he walks out like nothing ever happened. He's still wrapped up. He needs to be unbound. You see, this is where we must realize that there was much more happening than we see at first glance. You see, God is not surprised by our sufferings. God is not going around putting out unexpected fires, going like, oh, let's crack here, got to tape this, fix this, fix this. No, he knows. He's not a clumsy God. He knows, and he is intimately involved in every moment. But what does that involvement look like? Remember the question at the beginning when I asked, what was Jesus doing during those 2 days after he heard that Lazarus was sick? What was he doing? Was he just waiting around? No. What was Jesus doing during those 2 days? He was praying. And we can be confident about that. We can be confident. It's found in the text. He was praying. And one way to think of this is also just to look at the lifestyle patterns of Jesus, right? You read the Gospels, it's easy. You always see Jesus, he goes away to pray all the time. But that's not why we can be so sure that he was praying. Look again at verse 41. It says, so they took the stone away, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. Wait. Jesus thanks the Father for hearing him. But that's the first dialogue in this chapter that we have seen between Jesus and the Father. This is the first time we're seeing Jesus pray. And his only prayer is thanking the Father for hearing him. And this is where we realize that Jesus spent 2 days praying for this very moment. That's what he's thanking the Father for. Thank you for hearing my prayers when I was praying for those 2 days. Think about this. When it seemed like he was ignoring Mary and Martha's prayers, he was praying for them. If it ever seems like Jesus is ignoring your prayers, you look at this story and you see, oh, he's praying for you. Jesus is the God who prays for you. And you think about this. If Jesus felt it necessary to spend time praying and waiting when something came up, how much more should we do that when we are faced with the trials of life? Jesus doesn't just react and just try to put out a fire. He pauses and he knows he must pray to the Father. I think we can all learn from that. But don't be afraid. Don't be afraid if you find yourself impatient. Bring all of your if-onlys to Jesus and let him transform them into if-Jesus. You see, if Jesus is who he says he is, then before you ever bring your if-onlys to him, he's already praying for you. If Jesus truly is God in the flesh, then I can know that God weeps with me in my darkest of moments. If Jesus really is the resurrection, then he is calling your name, telling you to get out of the tomb, calling you to move on from the cobwebs and decay, and to follow him into new life and light. The story of Lazarus, it's only in the Gospel of John. It's not in the other 3 Gospels. And many have suggested that it's not in those other Gospels because those Gospel writers were trying to protect Lazarus from any unwanted and dangerous attention. As we'll continue on in our John study, we'll see that there are people who want Lazarus dead. They want to stop anyone from saying that this guy's been raised from the dead by Jesus, right? But by the time John wrote his Gospel, it was much later, and most of the first disciples had already, if not all of them, except for John, had already passed away, definitely including Lazarus. Before we end, I want us to look at verse 34 one more time. Okay? Verse 34, Jesus said, "Where have you laid him?" They said, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. Now keep that picture in your head. Where have you laid him? They said, "Lord, come and see." And he weeps. Now I want us to turn over to John chapter 20. Let's look at John chapter 20, starting in verse 10. This is huge, guys. This is enormous. John 20, verse 10 says, "Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping?' She said to them, 'They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him.' Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?' Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, 'Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away.' Jesus said to her, 'Mary.' She turned and said to him in Aramaic, 'Rabboni,' which means teacher. Jesus said to her, 'Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God.' Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, 'I have seen the Lord,' and that he said these things to her." Wow. We once again see Mary. There's some debate on whether or not Mary Magdalene is the same Mary who is from Bethany, who is Lazarus' sister. But when you look at the Gospel of John, it seems pretty clear that John considers them to be the same person. And so we see, once again, we see Mary, and she's weeping outside of the tomb again. But this time she doesn't have Jesus to cry at his feet. She says in verse 13, "I do not know where they have laid him." Do you see the parallel? Think about this. In chapter 11, Jesus is weeping outside of the tomb. In chapter 20, Mary is weeping outside of Jesus' tomb. In chapter 11, Jesus asks, "Where have you laid him?" In chapter 20, Mary asks, "I do not know where they have laid him." And in chapter 11, Jesus calls out Lazarus' name to bring him out of the tomb. And here in chapter 20, Jesus calls out the name of Mary, and her eyes are opened. Jesus tells Martha in chapter 11, verse 40, that if she believes, she will see the glory of God. See, this is what the glory of God looks like. It's not a king crushing his servants. It's not a God who is needy and is very easily offended, like, "Oh, how could you say that to me?" It's not like that. "I'm going to kill you because you said that to me." That's not what God looks like. This is what the glory of God looks like. It's a God who prays deeply for his people. It's a God who cries like a baby with us. A God who heals us beyond what we could have ever asked or hoped for. A God who calls you out by name to bring us out of the tomb, to open our eyes. A God who loves you. Jesus wasn't afraid to say that God so loved the world. But it's not just the world. It's each person. He loved Mary. He loved Martha. He loved Lazarus. Chapter 11, verse 5 says that explicitly. It says their names. He loves you. So how do we respond? How do we take all of this? It's incredible. How can we respond to this? We take our if onlys. We take them all right to Jesus. And we tell him, if only, if only, if only. We bring it all to him. And we let him daily teach us who he is. You see, you've known Jesus for a long time. Martha knew Jesus for a long time. And she needed Jesus to reintroduce himself to her. She knew him very, very well. And she needed to be reintroduced to who Jesus is. Hey, I'm the resurrection. Nice to meet you. Mary, she needed to be reintroduced to who Jesus is. And she was crazy close with him. And she looks at him and she doesn't recognize him as she is weeping in chapter 20, right? And he has to reintroduce himself to her. Mary, Jesus, everything that I've been wanting, yes. Let him reintroduce himself to you, and don't think that you have it all figured out, because you certainly don't. Neither do I. And after, so what do? We bring all of our if onlys to Jesus. We let him reintroduce himself to us daily, and we follow him. Even when it makes 0 sense on paper, we follow him. And you think about this in our passage, there's a couple ways people follow him. Lazarus, he follows Jesus out of the tomb, away from the tomb. In chapter 20, Mary, she follows Jesus away from the tomb. He says, you need to go and tell. Away from the tomb. You need to get away from the old, from the dying, from the decaying. Okay? And in our passage, I want us to think about this. One final thought. The disciples in this passage, they follow Jesus, right? Thomas says, all right, guys, let's go die with him. And they follow Jesus to a place called Bethany. Now, Bethany literally means house of the poor. It was a place filled with poor, sick, needy people. And he came to them, not just to fix everything with money, as we are so prone to do as Americans, right? No, he came to a place filled with poor, sick, needy people, and he came there to weep with them, to spend time with them, to be among them, to cry with them, to give them hope, and to show them just who God truly is. Let us never determine where God is, but follow Jesus to see just where God is. And here in our story, he is weeping with the broken. I love you guys. Go and do likewise. Trust in him. Youth Group Radio. Peace out.
Where are you? Why are you hiding? Who told you you were unfit for abiding with me? Songs are sung from broken bones when truth is cleansed you white like snow. As time slips by,